We had a delayed reaction. We had a delayed reaction to yesterday's Fed minutes that showed the Fed is concerned on how the tariffs will impact inflation. The White House is considering 25% tariffs on autos, pharma, and semiconductors. It shrugged that off yesterday. We're seeing a delayed reaction to that today. Also, we had now Walmart earnings dragging the Dow down, and retailers with the Walmart beat on earnings, but said that profit growth is going to slow in the current fiscal year. So the Dow was down over 1%, 451 points. The S&P 500 down just under 0.5%, 0.43 at 26, almost 27 points. The NASDAQ was down almost 0.5%. The Russell down almost 1%, and the VIX was up 2.55%. NVIDIA squeaked out a gain. It was up just a little bit, but down most of the session. Ended up getting a candle of indecision in the form of a doji. Again, after dropping from the high over here, we dropped 26.5%. We had the deep seek gap lower at 18% at the lows, went a little bit lower, ended up dropping a total from the high back over here, 26.5, nearly 26.5%. We're now filling that gap and hitting this trend line. Get a doji today, so again, continuing to monitor NVIDIA. We have earnings coming up here on the 26th, a few days from now. If we see NVIDIA begin to pull back ahead of earnings or with earnings, again, we could see that on the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ has moved to a new high, but it's not confirming it. It moved above the December high. Here we peaked in early January on NVIDIA right here, and we're not moving up to a new high on NVIDIA. And I talked about NVIDIA in great length and detail earlier in the week and talking about the resistance levels in the weekly time frame. So again, it does end up moving to a new high surrounding earnings. Again, I'm watching this trend line and then the trend line in the weekly time frame that's just slightly above that long-term trend line. I talked about that. I'll refer you to my videos earlier in the week, and I talked about NVIDIA in great length and detail. Now again, in early January, I told you we were going to bottom week of the 13th. We actually bottomed that day of the 13th. I told you we were going to bottom the following week, and we did on NASDAQ and S&P, and that's this trend line right here. We've risen back up. We filled the gap from the deep seek sell-off over here. We had gapped lower with the tariffs over here. Now we're back up at these highs, and we move slightly higher. If we can clear this area, and we're trying to get a bounce off of our 10-period moving average, if we can clear this area and continue, these trend lines are the trend lines that I'm watching from the July peak and from a parallel boundary with the lower trend line right here. We had test of this level, and so far it's not confirmed. We're going to be watching to see if it does, but the moving averages are still in a bullish arrangement. They're still pointing higher, and right now we're coming back and we're trying to bounce off our 10-period moving average at the moment. Possible bottoming tail or hanging man, depending on if we can get confirmation and a follow through to the upside on the NASDAQ. The MACD is still in positive territory. The RSI is above 50. Let me show you this up close. Here it is up close. I talked about this yesterday again. We got this push above the December high right here with this doji candlestick. And then that was on Tuesday. On Wednesday, we failed to confirm it by closing above the red dotted line right there. You had to close above the high right there to confirm it. We didn't do it. We had an intraday push above it, but we didn't close. And then we sold off today. We came back to the 10, and we're still not confirming it. Now, if this is a legitimate breakout at the moment, we need to be able to confirm that. Maybe if we have a bottoming tail up the 10 period, we can try to continue higher to go on and do that. If we end up getting a bigger sell-off right now, a bigger pullback, maybe to come back and fill this gap right here, or to test the low here, we still may come up here and go above this level, but we may see a bigger pullback. Again, in yesterday's video, I was talking about the divergence on the S&P 500 15-minute chart. Divergences on the 60-minute charts that were suggesting a pullback. We got that today. May not be done yet. 15-minute chart and the 60-minute chart on the S&P and versions on the 60-minute chart of NASDAQ, again, that did give us the sell-off. So again, there's no confirmation to this. We had a breakout but no confirmation. You need a confirmation and a follow through if this is real. And again, if we just build momentum and pull back and then do it, that's a possibility as well. But to have a legitimate breakout, you got to get confirmation and a follow through. We have neither. We do not have confirmation. We do not have the follow through. So we'll be watching. Maybe we get it here if we can try to get a bottoming tail there. But is it end up being a hanging man here? Ends up giving us a bigger pullback. It could really be either one because we're pulling back to the 10 period, which is support, but you're up near the high. So again, uncertain which one it is. NASDAQ daily chart. Now, the gap lower on the NASDAQ 5-minute chart took us lower. We rebounded back up. That gave us a bottoming tail at the 10 period, but we've stalled here at the 200 period in the 5-minute time frame. Got to get back above the 200, stay above it, and then be able to get the 50 back above it if this is going to be a bottom. If it's not, this area can still be tested and taken out. We start dropping below that 10 period in the daily, which is our bottoming tail low on the NASDAQ. Just something we're paying attention to. We had divergences, and I talked about it on the S&P. In these 15-minute time frames, we had these multiple point divergences here on NASDAQ. We had the divergence on the S&P 500 that gave us this sell-off. It goes back to the 200 here on the 15-minute chart. And again, we stalled at the 50 here on the 15-minute chart of NASDAQ. If we get rejection in this area, we go back and test this level again. Rejection at the 50 here on the 15. You get rejection at the 200 on the 5-minute chart. Then again, we can go back and test these lows. I'll be watching, and again, that is at that 10-period moving average in the daily time frame here on NASDAQ. Bounced off of, and you can see it here on the 200. Again, a bottoming tail on the 15-minute chart that we bounced off of. And we talked about the divergences on the 60-minute charts, and again, they played out here on the NASDAQ. We're pulling back here to the 50-period moving average. You got a trend line just below that to be watching now, and the breakout point right here. So again, that is a confluence of support there. And you got a gap fill down here. You got a gap fill right there. You got this rising trend line right here. And the last significant minor low back over here, which I believe was the gap lower on the CPI. I believe that was that gap right there. Got a possible rising wedge that could be carving out here if these just plain connect the dots with these trend lines. If we end up confirming and getting a fall through to the breakout of the, and I didn't draw that straight, a breakout of this level here. May pull back and build momentum to do that, but again, we'll be watching. Do we get confirmation and a fall through? And if we get confirmation and a fall through, we can go higher. Those trend lines in the weekly time frame. Again, so I'll be watching. Does NVIDIA pull back and we see a bigger pullback with NASDAQ? Because you got a possible channel. Also, you have this rising wedge, but if we start breaking down further, you got a possible channel under construction here on NASDAQ, something we're paying attention to there. If we get more volatility without being able to get confirmation and a follow through to the breakout to the upside on NASDAQ. Divergences have really done a good job in calling the tops and bottoms, short-term tops and bottoms. Here we had the confirmation of a lower high. Well, S&P got a divergence there in January. NASDAQ got a lower high. Other than that, these divergences have really called some interesting turning points. Watching the MACD, does it go negative and we end up getting a bigger sell-off here and get rejection right here? Taking out the 50 period, rejection off of the, dropping below the 50 here, getting rejection at the 50 on the 15-minute chart and that 200 period on the 5-minute chart. So again, getting a bounce off the 50, do we break it? Then we got these trend lines below. If we just get more of a mild pullback, we get a larger minor wave 5 under construction like the S&P, then again we could be we could see a parabolic move if we can get a confirmation and follow through above our high, validating a legitimate breakout right here in the daily time frame. Now, if we do that, if we can validate that or get a little bit more of a pullback, a mild pullback maybe or something, fill the gap or something, and then do it again. If you can get a confirmation follow through, you can go to higher levels, like the trend lines here from the July peak in the daily time frame and this upper channel line, like the trend line here in the linear The linear chart with our weekly chart here. Again, we fell short of it. A more powerful move, you have the trend line here with our log scaling on the NASDAQ weekly chart. S&P did the same thing as NASDAQ. We had the gap lower. And we came down, dropping below the 200 period, the black line right there. The 50 got back below it, and then we went back up. 50 still below the 200, but we went back up to test the 200 by the end of the session, rebounding off of the lows. NASDAQ, that's taken us back to the 50 period moving average here in the 15-minute time frame. So we're at the 50 period, stalling there on the 15-minute chart. We're stalling at the 200 on the 5-minute chart. Again, I talked about these divergences yesterday. They ended up playing out. I talked about a pullback on the 60-minute chart, and I talked about these divergences on the intraday charts. What would be bearish is to get rejection here and to drop below the 200 periods on the 15-minute charts and take out the lows from today. What would be bullish is a recovery. Have more gaps to be watching with today's gap lower. Divergence, as I talked about in yesterday's update, played out very, very nicely. I talked about yesterday's video and titled it, talking about expecting a pullback. Still expect new all-time highs in the future with the S&P 500. Talked about the divergence here with the RSI and on the MACD. We had yesterday some things that the market should have sold off on. Again, concerns about the 25% tariffs, as I mentioned, on autos, pharma, and semis. Concerns that the Fed is concerned about the tariffs, about inflation. I told you I was expecting this pullback, and I showed you this yesterday, and that's why, again, even if it's I told you, even if it's a pullback into the trading range, which now it is, again, these short-term price fluctuations, just choppy. Again, the main movement is higher, and we are likely in our subwave 3, predicted a bottom at that 2023 trend line right here to fill the gap from the election. I told you we are going to likely continue the election rally running inauguration day, and we did that right here. And then I told you we were going to pull back and back test this level. We did. I told you we were either going to get a higher low or a lower low and finish this and then continue. We got the higher low at the 200, and here we are. So we're still in this choppy range, but eventually we're going higher. In my opinion, we'll be watching to see how big of a pullback we get here. I'll be watching the low here now with another higher low, which makes a very nice trend line right here directly below. We'll be looking at that again. Just like NASDAQ, we're testing the 50 period and trying to bounce here, going to the 50 period on those 15-minute charts and finding resistance there. We hit support here. But these divergences that I talked about in yesterday's video have played out nicely. This may be a bigger pullback than I have marked here. I'll be watching this low if we end up getting a bigger Fibonacci retracement or not. We come back and fill the gap down over here. This trend line may change. So again, trend lines, short-term trend lines, they could change very easily. Now, similar situation here on the daily chart of the S&P. We had the December peak. Now, NASDAQ is pushing above the December peak. S&P had already done so at the January high, our first January high here. We had another test of that at the latter part of the month here on January 31st. But our first peak here in January, we tried to clear it, and we couldn't do it. We turned right back down, and then we tried to do it again here, and we couldn't confirm it. And then we tried to do it over here again in early February, coming back and filling the tariff sell-off gap. We went back up and filled the gap and tried to test that December high again. Couldn't do it, and again kept getting these sell-offs here, here, and then here. Now here we pull back at the higher low at our 50 period. We talked about that, a higher low or lower low. I expected once one of those scenarios played out that we were in a bottoming process when we go higher. We got the higher low scenario, and we went up here, and we did actually confirm above the December peak. Again, we got confirmation. This time we did get the follow through, and then we also have our January high now, which again, we closed above it by 1 point. And then we closed above it again. So I don't know if that's confirmation and a follow-through. Not very convincing, but I should say the confirmation bar wasn't very convincing, being just a point above the other there. So again, you do have a close above this level right here by 1 point, and then you've got that being the confirming bar, and then you got to follow through here. So we have now fairly confirmed and gotten a follow through above the December high. Again, a little question mark here, but you got the same kind of candlestick here on the NASDAQ. The NASDAQ got, you got a pullback to the 10 period. You got a bottoming tail there. Again, this is either a bullish hammer off of the 10 or it's a hanging man if it is confirmed to the downside. If it is, then again, you've got a test of this low coming if we end up taking out the 10 and the 20 period moving average. We'll be watching that, but again, confirmation bar was only 1 point high, so I don't know how convincing that is, but you did get a confirmation of 1 point above it, and then you got a follow through bar. We'll see if we get a pullback. Again, like I said, we could get a bigger pullback, still get a higher low above this level. Very, very possible. We are in the subwave three, which should be a powerful wave higher. I believe we're going up to the upper boundary of the rising wedge. So again, if we try to get a more of a pullback, and like I said yesterday, again, a lot of chop and slop. This is short-term price fluctuations. The main movement, in my opinion, is higher. Rally into April 1st or shortly thereafter, be just ahead of that in late March, just before the tariffs begin. You zoom out, here it is on the daily chart. And again, you can see, I believe we have minor wave 4 here with the bull flag. He was talking about the head and shoulders. I told you it's a fake pattern. I told you I believe that it evolved into a bull flag pattern. We saw that, and that's why I told you we were going to bounce right there after filling the election gap. And I told you that on the 9th and 10th. We did that on the 13th, the first day of the very next week, which I told you we were going to bottom that week, get a rally. We did. I believe we have wave 1, wave 2. I believe we're now in this subwave 3 of minor wave 5. And again, the picture is, I think we're headed to this trend line right here. And again, I think that will give us a top up here going into late March or probably early April, one of those two. The tax cuts that give us, or maybe some other economic news or something else that ends up giving us a rally, NVIDIA earnings, whatever it may be. See what happens with NVIDIA. About both scenarios with NVIDIA, that it can make a new high or that it doesn't. I talked about the resistance levels. If it does, I thought it had peaked, but again, may go up and hit those trend lines and try to make a new high. And I talked about that earlier in the week. I'll refer you to my videos earlier in the week to see that. But again, looking at this level here, so watching the MACD, does it try to roll over, or do we just get a bounce off that 10 period moving average? We do have, again, the longer term rising wedge in the daily time frame. If we zoom out, and again, I think we're headed to this upper boundary, and then I think we're going to see a top and the rising wedge begin to play out. I think the rise to the upper boundary, the rising wedge will take us up to the upper boundary of the channel here in the weekly time frame, and I think we'll see a peak there, a reversal back down to the lower boundary of the channel.